There are big bucks, and then there are bucks that become myth. Because size alone doesn't make a deer legendary. It's the story. And this one might be the strangest whitetail story ever told. A 10-point typical, so perfect, it looks like it was drawn up by a trophy artist. Shot in 1914, and then it vanishes. Not for a season, not for a year, but for decades. It's lost so completely that the hunter who killed it spends the rest of his life trying to convince people he is telling the truth. And the wildest part? The antlers were there the whole time, sitting in the dark, collecting dust, while the hunter lived just miles away. This is the story of the Jordan buck, a world record typical whitetail with a tail so twisted it feels like it shouldn't be real. And by the end of this, you're going to understand why people say some deer are more than deer and some deer become history. This is the Resurrection series. Let's go back to the morning it all started. November 20th, 1914, Burnett County, Wisconsin, near Danbury along the Yellow River with the Sioux Line Railroad cutting through the timber like a scar. A fresh snowfall has just laid down the kind of tracking canvas deer hunters dream about. 6 inches of white, clean, and quiet. The kind of snow that tells you exactly what happened in the woods while you were asleep. And on that morning, a 22-year-old woodsman named Jim Jordan gets up before daylight, pulls on his gear, and steps out into a world that feels brand new.
Take my hand in rough times, cold weather, I'll be your man. If it don't get better,
This isn't weekend warrior hunting. This is survival era hunting. The kind where venison means winter food, not just a grip and grin. Jim is a logger, a trapper, a hunter, a do what you gotta do kind of man. And he links up with his friend Aegis Davis, an older family man, railroad worker, and a guy who wants what most hunters want in 1914, meat. They hitch up a horse and wagon, head out pre-dawn, and the plan is simple. Track deer in the fresh snow, bring home venison, and that's it. But what they find is something neither of them could have imagined. To really understand how insane this story is, you have to understand the time. 1914 is a different universe. There's no trail cameras, no onX, no radios, no text messages, no, hey buddy, I'll drop you a pin. It's snow, tracks, instinct, and grit. In the gear, Jim is carrying what he has, not what he wishes he had. A Winchester lever action 25-20. Today, most people would call that undergunned. Back then, it's just what Jim owns. And he doesn't have a pile of ammo either. Just a few cartridges, so every shot matters. And on top of all that, the railroad is a major player in this story. The Sioux Line runs right through this country. Trains are loud, they cut through the woods, and deer bed near those tracks in the weeds and grass because the raised right-of-way gives them visibility. It's the kind of detail you don't think about until you've hunted deer long enough.
oh train, each time that you leave here, it lets me know you're gone.
Somewhere in the middle of all this lies the spark that ignites the whole legend. Not long after daylight, they cut deer tracks, multiple deer, and one set of tracks stops Jim cold. The hoof prints are huge, not big for the area, not nice buck tracks. The accounts describe them nearly elk-sized, wide, heavy, and splayed out. The kind of track that makes a hunter's brain instantly do what hunters do. It starts building a deer in your head, and Jim knows tracks don't always equal antlers. But still, he just can't let it go. He has to know what made those prints. Early on, Aegis shoots a doe. Perfect. Meat secured. Aegis suggests that they load the doe and head back, but Jim is locked in. He hands over his knife so Aegis can field dress the doe, and Jim keeps going on alone. So just like that, Jim walks away from the easy win because something in the snow just grabbed his imagination. And that decision starts a hunt that doesn't end for 64 years.
On down that track, you take my woman and I don't want.
Jim picks up the trail and follows it as it meanders along the railroad tracks. It's classic snow tracking, fresh sign, wandering, turning, looping. Then the tracks lead toward an opening near the right-of-way, tall grass and weeds, snow-laden, waist-high. Jim pauses, scanning for where the deer went next, and that's when he hears it. A sound that in 1914 means something bigger than just noise. A Sioux Line freight train. A whistle.
Oh, train.
The whistle cuts through the cold like a knife, and deer don't hear a train like we do. They feel it. They sense the vibration, they're bedded down, and suddenly their world is shaking. And then Jim sees movement. Heads popping up in the weeds, does first, and then a buck stands. And when he rises out of that grass, Jim sees what he later describes as the biggest buck he has ever laid eyes on. A heavy golden brown rack, 10 points, big beams, mass, and a perfect typical. And for a second, the buck is frozen, listening to the train, unaware of Jim's presence. Jim shoulders the 25-20 with iron sights. He aims at the neck. He squeezes the trigger. The shot cracks. Deer explode. Does scatter one way, the buck the other, and Jim fires again and again. He runs the magazine dry. Now the woods go quiet except for the train and Jim's breath. And he has that sinking feeling every hunter knows.
Door half open, air feels thick, clock on the wall, beating every tick. Shadows leaning closer than they should, hand on the railing, frozen where I stood.
Jim starts tracking fast, following those long, leaping strides, and at first there's no obvious sign. But he feels like he hit the deer. He wants to believe it. And then he pats his pockets frantically. He finds it. One more cartridge. Just one. And now the hunt becomes something different. Now it's not follow and shoot. Now it's a chess match. Because with only one bullet, you do not take a risky shot. You don't throw lead at brush. You wait. And that waiting, while tracking a giant buck, might be the most agonizing thing a hunter can do. He keeps going, and then he sees it. Blood. Not a lot, but enough to confirm this buck is hit. The tracks angle towards the Yellow River, and Jim starts catching glimpses. A flash of body, a rack moving through cover, and then gone. The buck is slowing, but Jim won't take the shot because he knows what his rifle is, and he knows what this deer is. A buck like that can haunt you forever if you mess it up. The buck reaches the river. It hesitates and then drops into the shallow current, and Jim closes in on the bank, watching it cross. The buck climbs the far side and stops, and then it turns. It looks back across the river at the hunter who's been trailing him. And in that moment, across the cold water, Jim makes a decision. He doesn't aim for the shoulder, he doesn't aim for the chest, he aims for the spine, because he is undergunned and this is his last bullet. He settles his iron sights, he fires, and the buck folds just like that. Jim wades into the icy river, moving fast, and now he's standing over him. A giant, heavy-bodied whitetail with a rack to match. People later estimate the live weight around 400 pounds. And now whether that number is exact or not, everybody agrees on one thing. This was an absolute monster. Jim reaches for his knife and feels an empty sheath. He loaned it to Aegis, but it's cold and the buck will keep. So Jim runs back to the farm for help, and this is where the story takes its first turn into the unbelievable. Jim finds Aegis, tells him everything, and grabs help. They head back to the river, and when they get there, the buck is gone. The biggest buck Jim has ever seen, the buck he just killed, vanished. Just a riverbank and a sick feeling in his stomach. They scan the bank and then it clicks. The buck must have slid into the river. And so they follow the current downstream, and around the first bend, they find him, lodged on a rock in midstream. Jim wades back out into waist-deep, icy water again and retrieves the deer. This should be the end. This is where most deer stories end. The deer is recovered, the town sees it, the hunter, the hero. But the Jordan buck story is just getting started, because now Jim wants it mounted, and that decision triggers the chain reaction. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when there's a buck like that. People come to see it, and among the admirers is a part-time taxidermist named George Van Castle. He's a railroad worker, lives nearby, and he does taxidermy on the side. He offers to mount the head for $5. Jim agrees, he hands over the unskinned head, and Van Castle takes it, reportedly on the railroad back towards his home. And when the buck leaves Danbury, Jim has no idea he won't see those antlers again for more than half a century. Months pass, no mount. Jim goes to find Van Castle and finds out Van Castle has moved. He tries to track him down and hears he's gone to Hinckley, Minnesota. But the journey isn't simple. Between them is the St. Croix, and bridges weren't always there like they are now. Travel is slow, life is hard, and time passes. And when Jim finally makes his way, he hears the next blow. Van Castle remarried, he moved to Florida, no forwarding address, and Jim assumes the mounted head went with him. The trophy is gone. Just like that, a world record buck gone. And this part matters because Jim doesn't just lose antlers, he loses proof. He loses the physical thing that would confirm his story forever. Now all he has is his memory. Life goes on. Deer seasons come and go. Wars happen. The world literally changes. Jim keeps hunting, keeps living, and what's crazy is the buck that made him legendary is somewhere out there, but nobody knows where. And that's the theme of this whole story. The Jordan buck is always close, but it's always hidden, like it's cursed or protected or meant to be a ghost. And then, decades later, we get the rummage sale. 1958, the late 50s. A guy named Bob Ludwig is at a rummage sale in Sandstone, Minnesota. He sees an old, crude deer mount, bad shape, antlers are dark with age. The mount looks like it's being held together with twine and a little bit of hope. But the rack stops him. It's huge, balanced, perfect, and so he buys it. Depending on the account, it's said that he pays $2 or $3. $2 or $3 for a buck that would later shake the whitetail world. He takes it home, moves it around. His wife isn't thrilled. It becomes one of those put it in the barn, put it in storage, get it out of the living room kind of trophies. And then, years later, Bob reads about the Boone and Crockett scoring system. He decides to roughly score the rack, and what he gets doesn't make sense. 200 plus inches, a number that doesn't belong on a random rummage sale deer. And so he reaches out to an official scorer, and eventually the rack gets measured for real. And the tape confirms something incredible. This mount is not just big, it's historic. The official score lands at 206 1/8 inches net typical, the new world record typical whitetail. Think about that. A new world record discovered like it's an antique lamp. But here's the issue. Nobody knows who killed it. Nobody can verify the story behind it. And so the records list the hunter as unknown, the location debated. And then comes one of the most unbelievable coincidences in North American hunting history. Bob Ludwig shows the rack to a relative, and that relative is Jim Jordan, the man who claims he shot a giant buck in 1914 and lost it. Jim takes one look and says, "That's my deer." Can you imagine that moment? But now there's a problem. Jim is the only living witness, and in some accounts, skeptics say Jim was a storyteller. He was a character, sometimes whose stories changed in the details. So even if he is telling the truth, how do you prove it? How do you prove a deer killed in 1914 is the same deer on the wall in 1964? Finally, in the December of 1978, Boone and Crockett rules Jim Jordan is recognized as the hunter. The location is corrected to Burnett County, Wisconsin. The Jordan buck becomes officially what it always was, a Wisconsin legend, a 1914 giant, a near-perfect 5x5. But then the last twist hits, and it's the cruelest one. Jim Jordan dies 2 months before the decision, and he never hears his name announced. The man who carried the story for a lifetime doesn't get to hear the ending. For decades, it sits near the top of the record book. Eventually, another buck surpasses it on paper, but paper doesn't change what it is. Because the Jordan buck is more than just a score. It's a story with everything deer hunters love. Fresh snow, tracking, a train whistle, flushing deer, a last bullet, a river crossing, a giant buck recovered twice. And eventually, the buck ends up displayed for the world to see. Replicas, celebrations, centennial events, heritage hikes, and sculptures. Because when a deer becomes this legendary, it becomes part of local identity. It becomes a piece of American hunting history. And honestly, it becomes a reminder. You never know what story you're stepping into when you step into the woods. And that brings me to something deeper, because there is a resurrection far greater than a deer, greater than a story, greater than a record book. The resurrection of Jesus Christ. The gospel tells us that Jesus was crucified, buried, and sealed in a tomb. His followers believed it was over, hope was gone, the story looked finished. But on the third day, the stone was rolled away, the tomb was empty, and what the world thought was lost forever was very much alive. The resurrection isn't just a moment in history, it's a declaration. The death does not get the final word. That truth cannot stay buried. That hope rises, even when it's been written off. The resurrection of Jesus stands at the ultimate proof that what God promises, He fulfills. And that's why stories like this matter. Not because they're incredible, but because they point to something bigger. We search the woods, we search history, we search for meaning. In the resurrection of Jesus, we find the answer to the greatest search of all: life, truth, and redemption. Thank you for watching this episode of the Resurrection series. It's been a pleasure bringing you this story.